The old dragon was dying when the woman found him. That was the part Veilkorath always began with when the younglings asked. Not the war, not the burning of the Thornspire colonies or the 3-year ash season that followed, when the skies above the Kethara basin turned the color of spent coal and the croplands cracked and nothing grew except bitterness. He started with the dying, because dying was where everything worth knowing had its root. But Veilkorath was not telling the story tonight for younglings. He stood on the observatory ledge of Drakenholm's upper spire, his massive frame silhouetted against a sky bruised violet and gold by the twin moons. His scales, once the deep indigo of a midnight sea, had faded to a pale, smoke-washed blue over the centuries, and the ridges along his spine had gone soft with age. He was 642 years old. He had outlived 3 emperors, 2 wars, and the entire Thornspire bloodline. And now, as the last warmth of the day drained from the stones beneath his claws, he was telling the story one final time. Not for younglings, for the Accord Council. They were arrayed behind him in the vaulted chamber, 17 dragons of rank, their scales catching the fading light through the crystal dome overhead. Councillor Thesrin had called the session. She wanted a vote, whether to seal the Kethara Basin sanctuary from all non-draconic contact permanently, whether to undo the 50 years of coexistence that Veilkorath's generation had bled to build. They wanted precedent, legal arguments, policy. He would give them a story instead. The war had been over for 9 days when I found the farmstead, Veilkorath said, his voice a low rumble that made the crystal panes hum in their leads. 9 days, and I was still trying to die. He let that settle. The younger counselors shifted on their elevated perches. The older ones, the 3 who remembered, or at least remembered the remembering, went still. I had taken a Sarathi lance through the wing joint at Thornspire, barbed design, with a slow venom that ate through membrane tissue faster than it could regenerate. I could not fly. I had been walking south through burned-out basin land for 6 days, drinking from bomb craters, eating nothing. My fire had gone cold 2 days before that. He paused. A dragon without fire is a dragon already halfway to the stone. You know this. Every hatchling knows this. But knowing it and feeling it are different. Feeling it is walking through a world you used to own and knowing that every step is subtraction. He turned from the ledge, and the council saw what he rarely showed. The scar. A puckered seam of pale tissue that ran from his left shoulder down through the wing membrane, warping the translucent skin into a permanent fold. The wing could extend, but it would never carry him at speed again. Not in 600 years had it healed fully. The venom had seen to that. It had laced the tissue with scar channels that tightened a little more with each passing decade, like a fist slowly closing. I collapsed against a fence line at the edge of a grain field. The posts were charred, the war had come through there. But someone had restrung wire between the blackened stumps. Someone was still farming. That small detail, new wire on burned posts, was the first thing in 9 days that made me lift my head. He paused, and his amber eyes swept the council. Thesrin, silver-scaled and rigid on her perch, would not meet his gaze. Her name was Maritsan. He said it the way you say the name of a river or a mountain, something that had always been there and always would be, something that existed independent of whether anyone spoke it aloud. She was a refugee cook, not a soldier, not a healer, not a diplomat, not anyone the war would remember in its official tallies. She had run a soup kitchen in the Kethara refugee camps during the siege, one of the emergency stations that fed whoever came through the line, human or draconic or half-blood. No questions, no papers, no species check. When the camps dissolved after the ceasefire, most of the kitchen workers were reassigned or simply wandered off. Merritt walked south with a cast-iron pot, a sack of dried lentils, and a determination that I have spent 5 centuries trying to find a word for and still cannot. She found the farmstead abandoned, the owners dead or fled, and she did the only thing she knew how to do. She lit a fire under the pot and started cooking. Veilkorath's claws scraped the stone floor as he shifted his weight. The sound was deliberate, a predator's trick, pulling attention back like a snapped thread. I was twice her height at the shoulder. My jaws could have taken her arm off at the root. My scales were crusted with ash from thornspire, and the venom had turned the flesh around my wound a blackish green that smelled of carrion. Flies had found me 2 days earlier and had not left. I was, by any rational measure, the most dangerous and repulsive thing that had crawled out of the war. He lowered his head, and she walked up to me with a ladle. A ripple of something, not laughter, something more like involuntary recognition, moved through the council. She did not run. She did not bow. She did not call for help or attempt the formal draconic greeting the way the diplomats did, with their careful grammar and their careful distance and their careful positioning upwind. She walked up to me the way she walked up to everyone in the soup line, measuring the need, not the species. She looked at my wound, wrinkled her nose because it did smell appalling, and she said, in common speech, the same voice she used for a hungry refugee or a lost child, "That looks infected. Sit still." Veilkorath lowered his great head nearly to the floor, and for a moment the council saw not the elder statesman, but the broken creature he had been, a war dragon with no fire, pressing his jaw against the earth while a woman half his size told him what to do. I sat still. He let silence fill the chamber, 2 heartbeats, 3. She went back to the farmhouse and returned with a basin of boiled water, clean cloth torn into strips, and a jar of something that smelled like turpentine and garlic. Field medicine, the kind humans teach each other in refugee camps because there are never enough real medics and the supply lines have been burned. She knelt beside me, soaked the strips, and began cleaning the wound. She was thorough. She was not gentle because gentleness would not have served, the rot had crusted over in layers, and anything less than force would have left the poison sealed inside. She scrubbed the infection out of my flesh with the same brisk efficiency she used to scrub the soup pot, and when I flinched, a war dragon flinching, she said, "I know, hold on." The venom had gone deep. The barb was still in the joint. I could feel it grinding against the bone with every breath, a splinter of Sarathi iron lodged in the architecture of my wing. She found it with her fingers. I want the council to understand what that means. She put her bare hands inside the open wound of a war dragon who outweighed her 40-fold, who could have killed her with an involuntary spasm, and she felt around the ruined tissue until she found the barb. It took her 20 minutes. She spoke the entire time not to me but to herself, the muttering of a woman working a problem. Deeper than I thought. There's a second point, no, that's bone, hold still. There. And then she gripped it, braced her knee against my shoulder for leverage, and pulled. I roared the first sound I had made in 6 days, and the force of it shattered 2 of her kitchen windows and knocked a hanging pot off its hook inside the house. She did not flinch. She examined the barb, turning it in the light, and said, "Nasty piece of work. They designed this to stay in." Then she dropped it in a bucket, packed the wound with the garlic paste, and bound it with the cloth strips tied off in a knot I later learned was called a surgeon's hitch. Then she went inside, brought out a bowl of lentil stew, and set it on the ground in front of me. Councillor Thesrin's crest had flattened against her skull. The involuntary submission reflects that all dragons exhibit when confronted with something they cannot categorize. She caught herself and forced it upright, but several of the younger councillors had seen it. I had not eaten in 4 days. The stew was thin, more water than substance, the kind of food you make when supplies are low and the line is long, and you have learned to stretch everything past the point of reason. She had seasoned it with dried herbs from a window box, something sharp and green that cut through the taste of blood and rot in my mouth. He lifted his head. It was the finest meal I have ever had, and I have eaten at the emperor's table. Several of the younger councillors exchanged glances. They were thinking this was a story about kindness. It was not. Not yet. It was a story about what kindness makes possible when you strip away every condition. She fed me for 11 days. Every morning before dawn, she checked the wound, pressing the flesh around the edges, smelling the drainage, measuring the color change against the day before with the practiced eye of someone who had seen infection before and knew its moods. She changed the dressing and left a pot of whatever she had made: barley porridge with a knob of rendered fat, root soup with wild garlic, a grain mash with leeks she had found growing wild behind the barn. She cooked it all in the same cast-iron pot, rinsed and repurposed each day, and the pot never cooled entirely. She banked the coals each night and rebuilt the fire each morning, so the iron stayed warm. She never asked my name. She never asked which side I had fought on. She never asked if I would hurt her because the question did not seem to occur to her as relevant. She treated me the way she treated every creature that came through her line, as someone who was hungry and hurt and who deserved to eat. The deserved was the part that mattered. Not earned, not qualified for. Deserved as a baseline, the way any living thing deserves air. On the third day, I could lift my head without the world going gray at the edges. The garlic paste was working. The rot smell had faded to something merely unpleasant, and new tissue was forming beneath the dressing, pink and raw but alive. On the fifth, I stood. My legs shook so badly that the fence posts rattled in their holes and the new wire hummed like a plucked string. Merritt came out onto the porch, watched me stand, and said nothing. She just waited, the way you wait for someone learning to walk, ready but not intervening. On the seventh, I walked to the water trough and drank on my own. She was on the porch, shelling dried beans into a bowl. She looked up, nodded once, a job completed, nothing more, and went back to her shelling. On the eighth day, I tried to flex the wounded wing. The membrane pulled taut against the scar tissue, and a white-hot line of pain ran from the shoulder to the wingtip. I could extend it perhaps 2/3 of the way, enough to balance, not enough to fly. Merritt watched from across the yard, said, "Don't force it." Scar tissue doesn't argue, it just holds, and went back to hoeing a patch of ground she was trying to coax into a vegetable garden. Vale-Korath turned fully to face the council now, his bulk filling the stone archway between the observatory ledge and the chamber proper. On the 9th day, the Sarathi scout found us. The air in the chamber changed. Even the crystal panes stopped their faint harmonic. A young one, barely into his second growth, scales still patchy with adolescence, the adult coloring coming in uneven across his shoulders and flanks like a map with half its borders drawn. He had been tracking my blood trail south, probably hoping to finish what the lance had started. A fresh kill on a war dragon would earn a Sarathi his first war mark, and this one was old enough to want one and young enough to believe it would matter. He came over the ridge at a run, all adrenaline and clumsy aggression, and stopped dead when he saw me standing upright in the yard. He had expected a corpse, or at best a cripple too far gone to fight. Instead, he found a living war dragon, wounded, yes, and fireless, yes, but standing, with a human woman positioned directly between them, holding a soup ladle. Merritt did not move. She did not raise the ladle as a weapon, because it was not a weapon and she was not a fool. She did not step aside, because stepping aside was not something she did. She looked at the scout the same way she looked at everyone who appeared at the edge of her farmstead. She measured him against the only question that mattered. "Are you hungry?" The scout stared. I could see his war training trying to process the situation. An unarmed human female addressing a Sarathi warrior in the common tongue as if he had simply wandered up to the wrong lunch counter. His combat instincts said charge. His adolescent confusion said freeze. His stomach, which had been empty for 3 days, said something else entirely. He was hungry. He had been ranging alone for days, eating field mice and creek water. His ribs showed through his patchy scales. The war had ended without anyone telling him, and he was a child playing at violence, because the adults who should have stopped him were dead or scattered or simply had not bothered. I watched Merritt's face as she took this in. I saw the exact moment she decided. The same moment she had had about me, the same calculation, applied without modification to a creature whose species had put a lance through my wing 9 days ago. The math was simple. This one is hungry. I have food. The rest is noise. She set a second bowl. Vale Korath's voice had dropped to a register that hummed in the marrow. The council chamber was absolutely still. The scout ate 3 bowls, and he licked the rim of the third like a hatchling cleaning an egg. Then he fell asleep against the fence post with his tail curled around his own legs, the adolescent tuck, which you have all seen in the nursery crags. He was 17, and he slept like a 5-year-old. Merritt draped a horse blanket over him. She did not ask my permission. She did not ask his. She saw a cold creature and she covered it. That night, after the scout woke and ate again, more cautiously this time, watching me with one eye while he chewed, I told Merritt my name. Not my war name, not my rank designation. My egg name, Vale Korath. The syllable my mother had breathed onto my shell before I cracked it, the private word that no dragon speaks aloud except to those they trust with the innermost part of themselves. I had not spoken it in 200 years. She said, "That's a good name." Then she asked if I wanted more stew. No one in the council moved. Outside, the night bell chimed the quarter hour, and not one of them turned toward the sound. The scout's name was Kellarin. He told us on the 3rd day when he stopped flinching every time I shifted my weight. He had been conscripted at 15 from a border settlement that no longer existed. He did not know where his family was. He did not know the war was over. When Merritt told him, he sat very still for a long time, staring at his own claws. Then he picked up the water buckets and walked to the well. He carried water 8 times that day without being asked or thanked. It was the first useful thing anyone had asked of him since his conscription, and I think, watching his face as he walked back and forth, the buckets slopping against his patchy flanks, it was the first time in 2 years he had felt like something other than a weapon waiting to be aimed. Over the next 3 weeks, more came. The basin was full of the displaced and the discarded, the wreckage that every war produces and no ceasefire addresses, because ceasefires are written by people who have never stood in a soup line. He paused, letting his gaze move slowly across the councilors. A human farmer named Torin and his daughter Asha, walking north from the burned lowlands with an empty cart, and nothing in it except a blanket and a clay jug. The girl was 7 and had not spoken since the shelling that killed her mother. Merritt did not try to make her speak. She gave her a bowl and a task sorting dried beans by color into separate baskets, and the girl sorted beans for 3 days without a word, her small hands moving through the pile with the absolute focus of someone who has found one thing in the world that makes sense. On the 4th morning she looked up and said, "The brown ones taste better." First sentence in a month. A draconic mother named Jessra and her 2 hatchlings, whose wings had been clipped by Sarathi raiders to keep them grounded, cuts precise and deliberate, designed to heal badly, designed to leave flight impossible. I will not describe the cuts further. What I will say is that Merritt looked at those wing stumps, the scarred, folded tissue where clean membrane should have stretched, and her face went perfectly still. Not with horror, not with the theatrical sympathy that covers inaction, with the cold, focused anger of a woman identifying a problem she fully intended to solve. She set 3 bowls. Then she sat down with the hatchlings and told them she knew a human bone setter who might help. She was lying. There was no bone setter, but within a week she had found a water-stained medical manual in the farmhouse, and she studied it the way she studied everything, by doing. She practiced splint work on branches. She examined the scar tissue with her fingers, mapping the damage the way she had mapped the barb in my wing. Within 3 months, those hatchlings were gliding. Not full flight, the damage was too severe for that, but gliding. Short arcs from the barn roof to the yard, the air catching under their splinted membranes, their small bodies lifting for 3 or 4 seconds before the gentle descent. Enough to feel the wind, enough to feel like dragons. a Kethori trader named Bassam whose caravan had been stripped by deserters from both sides, who arrived with nothing except his skill at building things from salvage. A pair of half-blood adolescents, Ren and Talia, turned away from both human and draconic refugee stations because they fit neatly into neither category, and bureaucracies require neat categories to function. An old draconic female named Varicin, of the opal line, whose scales had gone translucent with age, and whose fire was nothing but a faint warmth in her throat, barely enough to heat her own chest. 400 years old, and she had been walking for 8 days because no one would carry her, and she was too proud to lie down and too stubborn to die on a road. Merritt gave Varicin the only bed in the farmhouse. She moved her own blankets to the floor without discussion, without announcement, without anyone asking. The bed was needed more by someone else. The math. Veilkorath moved into the chamber now, his steps slow and deliberate, each one placing his weight with the care of a creature who had learned across 6 centuries that rushing led nowhere worth arriving. The thing I want you to understand, the thing that matters more than any of the names or the numbers, is that none of this was planned. There was no charter, no mission statement, no intake process, no committee meeting to decide whether a Sarathi scout should be allowed to eat beside an indigo guard dragon whose wing he would have been cheering the destruction of 3 weeks earlier. Merritt did not sit us down and explain a philosophy of coexistence. She simply cooked. And the cooking created a gravity that pulled the broken things in. A draconic medic named Thesson, no relation to our esteemed counselor, though the name gives me pause, arrived on the 16th day. She had been attached to the Imperial Rear Guard and had been walking west for 2 weeks after her unit dissolved. She had training that Merritt lacked: proper wound care, pharmaceutical compounding, bone-setting techniques that did not come from a water-stained manual. When she saw my wing, she examined it for 20 minutes and then told me bluntly that the scar channels would never open, that full flight was gone, and that I should stop trying to force the extension because I was tearing new tissue every time. It was the first honest medical assessment I had received, and I valued it precisely because she did not soften it. She also looked at Merritt's garlic paste, smelled it, and said, "This is terrible medicine. It worked because you are very stubborn and the patient is very large." Merritt laughed, the only time I heard her laugh about the war, and said, "Works the same as soup, then." Thesson stayed. She built an infirmary in the barn, nothing elaborate, just clean straw and boiled bandages, and a shelf of compounds she mixed from basin plants. Within a week she was treating everyone: the farmer's cough, the half-blood teenager's joint aches from the plastering work, Varicin's failing eyesight, which she could not cure but could slow with a warm compress that eased the pressure behind the old one's translucent scales. She was the first person in the settlement who had arrived with professional skills rather than just need, and Merritt treated her exactly the same as everyone else: a bowl, a task, equal standing. Within a month there were 31 of us. Human, draconic, half-blood Kethori. The farmstead was not large enough, so we built. Torin new construction, he and Ashad laid foundations, the girl carrying stones in a bucket half her size with a gravity that made grown dragons step aside. I hauled timber from the ridge forests, dragging logs with my good wing folded and the scarred one aching with every step. Bassam rebuilt the perimeter fence and rigged a rainwater collection system from salvaged metal sheeting. He scavenged from the ruins of a supply depot 3 miles north. The half-blood teenagers, Ren and Talia, turned out to be extraordinary plasterers. Their mixed physiology gave them the fine motor control of humans combined with the heat tolerance of dragons, so they could apply and smooth plaster faster than any pure species worker I had ever seen, their hands shifting effortlessly between precision and endurance. Varicin could barely see and could no longer walk more than a few dozen steps without resting, but she sat by the hearth with the clipped hatchlings every evening and hummed to them in old draconic, the egg songs, the nesting prayers, the lullabies that had been passed down through the opal line for 1,000 years, music that existed before empires. The hatchlings would curl against her translucent flanks, their damaged wings tucked close, and listen until they slept. It was the most important work anyone in the settlement did, and Marit knew it. She never once suggested that Varison do something more productive. When I asked her about it, why let the old dragon sit and sing when there was timber to haul and walls to raise, she looked at me as if I had asked something profoundly stupid. Those children need to know what they are, she said. Varison is the only one who can tell them. And Kelarin, the Sarathi scout who had come to her farmstead to kill me, carried water. 8 trips a day, every day, sun or rain, without being asked or acknowledged. When the first well ran low, he dug a second one. Alone. 4 days of work, his adolescent shoulders straining against the shovel, his patchy scales caked with mud. When he finished, he sat on the edge of the stone collar he had laid and looked at his hands as if seeing them for the first time, as if they had done something other than hold a weapon, finally, and the sensation was so unfamiliar he needed a moment to understand it. Nobody gave orders, nobody pulled rank, nobody assigned quarters by species or work by physical capacity. The only authority was the soup pot, and the only governance was Marit's single unspoken law. You eat, then you help. What you help with depends on what you can do. What you eat depends on what there is. Nobody eats until everyone eats. Veilkorath stopped in the center of the chamber, beneath the crystal dome. Twin moonlight fell on him from above, casting overlapping shadows of his horns on the marble floor, one shadow sharp, one diffuse, like a creature split between 2 versions of itself. I tell you this, he said, his voice filling every corner of the vaulted space, because in 642 years of living, in 2 wars and 3 imperial councils, and an empire that has risen and crumbled and risen again, I have never seen a more effective form of governance than a woman with a soup ladle who refused to distinguish between species. The words landed like stones dropped into still water, and the ripples moved outward through the silence. The accord did not begin in a council chamber, he continued. It did not begin with a treaty or a declaration or a symposium on interspecies policy. It began with a cast-iron pot and a woman who asked every creature the same question: Are you hungry? Councillor Thesrin's crest rose slightly, a challenge forming, surfacing through the involuntary deference like a stone breaking the surface of a lake. With respect, Elder, she said, her voice cool and precise as quartz, one farmstead does not constitute a governance model. The Kethara Basin today contains. I have not finished. The 2 words hit the air with a weight that had nothing to do with volume. Thesrin's crest flattened again. She did not speak. On the 42nd day, the Emperor's scout wing found us. Veilkorath let that sit. 6 dragons of the Imperial Vanguard, in full war panel, dropping out of a clear afternoon sky with the sun behind them. They had been surveying the basin for survivors, cataloging the dead, tallying the displaced, assessing the damage in neat columns that would become reports, that would become policy, that would be debated by creatures who had never missed a meal. They were not expecting to find a functioning settlement. They were certainly not expecting to find Veilkorath of the Indigo Guard, listed as killed in action 6 weeks prior, funeral rites already spoken, name already carved on the memorial wall at Drakenholm, hauling fence posts alongside a human refugee cook, while a Sarathi scout carried water and a pair of half-blood teenagers plastered walls, and an ancient opal-line matriarch hummed egg songs to a clutch of wing-clipped hatchlings. Commander Drathil landed first. She was a hard creature, 40 years on the frontier, scales scarred from beak to tail tip, a reputation for efficiency that bordered on cruelty. She had overseen dispersals. She had signed relocation orders. She looked at Marit's farmstead, at the impossible assembly of species and ages and broken histories working side by side in the afternoon light, and her expression was one I have spent 6 centuries trying to name. It was not surprise, not disapproval, not the bureaucratic consternation of an officer finding an unauthorized operation outside the chain of command. It was the look of someone seeing something they had believed was impossible, and realizing, with a sensation closer to vertigo than insight, that their belief had been the only thing making it so. He paused 3 heartbeats. Drathil did not speak to me first. Military protocol required her to address the highest-ranking draconic authority, which was technically me. She ignored the protocol. She walked on the ground, in full war panel with the campaign decorations catching the light, across the yard to where Marit stood stirring the evening pot. The commander was 3 times Marit's height. Her shadow covered the woman entirely. Marit looked up. She held the ladle steady. She said, "Dinner's in 20 minutes. You're welcome to stay." Drathil, Commander Drathil, who had overseen dispersals and signed relocation orders, and never once in 40 years hesitated over a difficult decision, said, "Thank you," and she sat down. She and her wing ate dinner with us, lentils and root vegetables and barley, the same meal everyone received, served in the same clay bowls that Ren and Talia had fired in a kiln they built from river stones. I watched a frontier commander sit cross-legged on the ground, a posture of equals, which she had not used since she was a cadet, and eat alongside a Sarathi orphan and a Kethori trader, and a 7-year-old human girl who brought Drathil a second bowl without being asked. The girl held it up with both hands, her face solemn with the gravity of the task, and something in the commander's expression shifted permanently. I saw it happen. One moment she was an officer assessing a situation. The next she was a creature being offered food by a child, and the food mattered, and the child mattered, and the protocols did not. The next morning, Drathil sent a runner to the Emperor. Her message was 3 lines. She told me later, told me many times, because she wanted someone to remember. Basin settlement found. Mixed population, human, draconic, half-blood, functional. Recommend study before resettlement orders proceed. She could have written anomaly and ordered dispersal. She could have written unauthorized settlement and sent enforcers. She chose the word functional. That word, Veilkorath said, changed the course of the empire. He let it breathe. The emperor sent an envoy, a career diplomat named Verith, who arrived expecting to find a humanitarian crisis, and instead found a functioning community that made no sense by any metric the empire used to measure such things. He stayed a week. He observed. He filled 3 notebooks with observations, and then threw the first 2 away because they were full of categories that did not apply. Mixed species settlement implied separation being bridged. This was not a bridge. It was a place where the concept of separation had simply never been introduced, because Marit had never thought to introduce it. Verith asked Marit for an organizational chart. She gave him a puzzled look and said, "We eat breakfast, then we work, then we eat lunch, then we work some more, then we eat dinner. Is that a chart?" He asked who resolved disputes. She said, "Disputes about what? If it's about food, there's enough. If it's about work, I say what needs doing and people do what they can. If it's about something else, they sit down and sort it out over soup, because it is very hard to stay angry at someone while you are both holding bowls." Verith returned to the capital with his 3rd notebook, the one where he had stopped trying to categorize and simply described what he saw, and told Emperor Rithal III that a human refugee cook was running a mixed-species settlement with no charter, no funding, no mandate, no legal framework, and no problems. Rithal did something no emperor had done in recorded history. He went himself, unannounced, unguarded. He flew alone across 400 miles of basin land and landed at the gate of a farmstead that did not appear on any map. The council stirred. This was not in the official record. I was in the yard when his shadow crossed the field. Every dragon alive knew that shadow. The wingspan of the golden line blocked the sun like an eclipse. The light did not dim so much as shift, as if the sky itself were making room. He landed at the gate, folded his wings with the precision of absolute power under absolute control, and surveyed the farmstead with eyes that had weighed empires and found most of them short. Marit was hanging laundry. She looked at the largest dragon in the known world, standing at her gate with golden scales throwing light like a second sun. And she said, "I swear this on my egg name, if you're here about the fence permit, I never applied for one." Rithal laughed. I had never heard an emperor laugh. It sounded like boulders rolling downhill in a warm rain, enormous and unhurried and genuinely delighted. Veilkorath's eyes had gone distant, seeing a yard that no longer existed, a woman who had been dead for 570 years, and the largest dragon in the world standing at her gate, laughing about fence permits. He stayed 3 days. He ate from the pot, the same thin stew, the same clay bowls. He helped Varison move to a warmer spot when the wind shifted the emperor of the draconic realm, positioning cushions for an old female whose fire had gone to embers, his golden claws arranging threadbare padding with a delicacy that startled everyone who saw it. He sat with Kellarin and listened, truly listened, with the focused patience of a predator tracking something important, as the boy talked about what it was like to be 17 and alone in a war nobody had explained to you. He watched Jessra's hatchlings glide from the barn roof, their splinted wings catching the air, and he said nothing. But I saw his claws dig into the earth when he understood what had been done to their wings and who had mended them. On the second evening, he found me stacking firewood behind the barn. He stood beside me and said nothing for a long time, which is the draconic way of asking a question too important for words. So I answered it. I told him about the first morning, the ladle, the garlic paste, the barb she pulled with her bare hands. I told him about the second bowl she set for the Sarathi scout who had come to kill me. I told him about Varison's egg songs and Ashaz's brown beans and Kellarin's well. I told him everything this council has heard tonight. When I finished, Rithal said, "In 40 years I have never built anything that works this well." I said, "You never tried this recipe." On the third day, he sat with Marit on the porch as the sun went down, gold and red light across the basin, the sky finally remembering what it looked like without ash. He asked the question that the envoy had missed, that Drathil had missed, that I had missed in all my supposed wisdom. How do you decide who to help? Marit was peeling a root vegetable. Her hands did not stop, peel, turn, the automatic rhythm of 10,000 meals. She said, "I don't decide, they're hungry, I cook. That's the whole thing." Rithal was quiet for a long time. Then, "I have spent 40 years building an empire on the principle that order must be imposed. You have built this in 6 weeks on the principle that people will find their own order if you feed them first." Marit shrugged. "I don't know about principles. I just know that nobody ever built anything useful on an empty stomach." Veilkorath stopped walking. He stood in the exact center of the council chamber, directly beneath the crystal dome's apex, and the twin moons cast his shadow in 2 directions, one reaching toward the council, one toward the observatory and the basin below. The Cathara Accord was signed 4 months later, the first treaty in the Empire's history granting equal standing to human, draconic, and half-blood residents of a shared settlement, modeled line by line, clause by clause on the way Marit San ran her farmstead: equal food, equal work, equal voice. No one eats until everyone eats, disputes resolved at the common table, resources allocated by need, not lineage, not wingspan, not the number of syllables in your egg name. Rithal wanted to name it the San Accord. Marit told him that giving a soup kitchen a fancy name was the fastest way to ruin it. He named it the Cathara Accord instead, and she allowed that because it was the name of a place, not a person, and places do not get embarrassed. The council was silent. Even the dome had stopped its faint resonance. Marit never held an official position. The Accord named her basin steward, a title she accepted only because it came with a supply budget that let her buy lentils in bulk. She used the title exactly once in a letter to an imperial supply officer who had questioned why a human was requisitioning grain for a mixed-species settlement. The letter read in its entirety, "I am the basin steward. The basin is hungry. Send lentils." The officer sent lentils. He also sent a note that said, "Received." Sending double. It was the most efficient piece of imperial correspondence in the history of the realm, and Drathil, who by then had retired from the vanguard and was living in the settlement as a civilian, the first frontier commander to ever voluntarily surrender her war panel, kept a copy of it pinned above her sleeping ledge until the day she died. The settlements grew, not by decree, by gravity. Word moved through the basin the way water moves through cracked earth, finding the low places, the dry places, the places where something was needed. Refugees came. Veterans came. Families came, mixed families, families that had existed in secret during the war and could finally stop hiding. A human engineer named Das arrived with a set of irrigation plans he had designed for a mixed labor force. Channels dug by dragons, gates operated by humans, filtration managed by half-bloods, and within a year the farmstead was producing 3 times the grain of any single species operation in the empire. Other settlements modeled themselves on merits, not because anyone ordered them to, because it worked. Because when you build a community around a pot instead of a charter, the pot does not care what species is holding the ladle. That was 50 years ago by the long calendar. 47 settlements now. Mixed populations doubled and redoubled. Cross-species conflict at less than a third of the imperial average. Agricultural yield per acre higher than any single species district in the empire, because when dragons clear land, humans engineer irrigation, and half-bloods do the precision cultivation that neither manages alone, the math just works. Not because of policy, because of soup. He turned to Thesrin. "And now you want to close it." Thesrin straightened on her perch, silver scales catching the moonlight, composure reassembled with visible effort. "The motion is not to destroy the accord, Elder. It is to protect draconic sovereignty. The human population has grown beyond the original parameters and the dilution of draconic cultural practices. Marit San learned Old Draconic in 3 months. Thesrin stopped. Veilkorath let the silence work. He had learned patience from a woman who peeled vegetables while talking to emperors. He could afford to let a counselor sit with an unfinished sentence. "You speak of dilution as if culture were a liquid that weakens when you add water," he said. "It is not. Culture is a fire. It does not weaken when you share it, it spreads." She learned it because Varison needed someone to speak with. The old one's common speech was dissolving, words returning to the ancestral tongue the way a river returns to its source. Marit sat with her every evening after the cooking was done, and learned the language of our egg songs, so that a 400-year-old dragon would not die surrounded by voices she could no longer understand. "Is that the cultural dilution you mean?" Thesrin's jaw tightened. She did not answer. She learned our nesting prayers so she could speak them over Jessra's hatchlings when they woke crying in the dark. Because wing-clipped hatchlings do wake crying, counselor, and they cry for comfort in the oldest words they know, and someone must answer them in a language that feels like safety. She learned the death rites so she could sing them for Kellarin when the venom he had carried from his own war wound finally reached his heart at 23. She buried a Sarathi scout, a boy who had come to her farmstead to kill me, with full draconic honors, every word in place, every gesture correct, and she wept for him as though he were her blood. Because he was. Everyone who ate from that pot was her blood. When Kellarin died, the settlement mourned him, all of them, every species. The human farmer Torin, who had fought against Sarathi raiders and had every reason to hold a grudge, stood at the burial and spoke about the well Kellarin had dug. He said, "That boy gave us water. That's worth more than anything the war took." Asha, his daughter, 14 by then, no longer silent, no longer sorting beans, played a human morning song on a pipe she had carved from river reed. And Jessra's hatchlings, the ones with the splinted wings, glided over the burial site in slow arcs, their shadows crossing the grave like benedictions. That is what Merit built, not a policy framework, not an interspecies governance model. A place where a Sarathi orphan could be mourned by the people he had been trained to kill, and where the mourning was not an act of political theater, but the genuine grief of a family that had chosen each other across every line the world had drawn. Vale Korath's voice had not risen. That was the terrible part, the part the council would carry longest. It stayed at the same low, unhurried register throughout, and the weight of it grew with every sentence, like water filling a basin, rising without turbulence until it reached the rim and then continuing to rise. I have heard the arguments for sealing, purity of tradition, sovereignty of species, the preservation of what we were before the accord. I have heard them before, the same words spoken by different crests. I heard them from the officers who called Merit's farmstead an unauthorized anomaly. I heard them from administrators who had never eaten from a bowl a half-blood teenager had fired in a handmade kiln. I heard them from dragons who had never learned another creature's death rites because they had never needed to, because no one they loved had ever been a different species. He looked at each of them, 17 dragons, 34 eyes. I am 642 years old. I will not see another century, the healers have been clear, and I have no interest in the theater of disputing what is obvious. The wound from Thornspire has been closing on my heart for longer than most of you have been alive, the venom working inward a fraction of a year at a time, and they tell me it will finish within the decade. I do not say this for sympathy. I say it because what I tell you next is the last thing I will ask of this council, and I want the weight behind it to be unmistakable. Merit San died at 87. Human lifespan, a blink, measured against hours. I was with her. She was in the farmhouse, in the bed that had been Veracin's, the old dragon having passed 20 years before, surrounded by the hatchlings she had hummed to sleep for 2 decades, her translucent scales finally going still. The settlement was 214 souls by then, gathered in the yard, human and draconic and half-blood, standing the way they had always stood, without sorting. Merit could not see them by the end, but she could hear the hatchlings, Jessra's grandchildren, the ones whose parents had been clipped but who had hatched with whole wings, because the damage was not in the blood, only in the flesh, and flesh can be mended. Those grandchildren were playing in the field beyond the fence, and the sound of their wings, that clumsy, rushing, joyful sound of young dragons learning what the air feels like, filled the house like wind through an open door. Her last words were not profound. No speech, no prophecy, no principle of governance for the record. She said, "Is the pot still on?" I told her it was. She said, "Good, don't let it burn." I have kept that pot on for 570 years. The chamber held its silence the way a vessel holds water, completely, without a seam for it to leak through. The Cathara Basin Sanctuary exists because a woman with a ladle decided that hungry creatures deserve to eat. It exists because she did not distinguish between a broken war dragon and a frightened Sarathi scout, and a trader with nothing left and an old female too proud to lie down. She fed them all the same soup from the same pot in the same bowls, and from that feeding came a settlement, and from that settlement came an accord, and from that accord came everything this council now sits in the comfortable privilege of debating whether to dismantle. You want to seal it, put it to a vote, but know what you are sealing, not a policy, not a border provision, a pot of soup, and the question that has kept it on the fire for half a millennium, are you hungry? I am asking this council the same question Merit asked me the day I collapsed against her fence. Not about food, about something older than food, older than empire, older than the difference between scales and skin. Are you hungry for a world where a war dragon and a refugee cook and a Sarathi orphan and a pair of half-blood teenagers can sit at the same table, eat from the same pot, and build something that outlasts all of them? Because if you are, the answer is the same as it has always been. Sit down, eat, help. Veilkorath stood in the silence that followed, and the silence was its own answer. It was Thesrin who moved first. The silver-scaled counselor rose from her perch, and every eye in the chamber tracked her descent. She crossed the floor, not flying, walking, as Drathil had walked across a farmyard half a millennium ago, until she stood before the elder. "I withdraw the motion," she said. Veilkorath inclined his head. Just that, the smallest acknowledgement, the same nod Merit had given him the day he walked to the water trough on his own. A job completed, nothing more. One by one, the counselors descended, not in ceremony, not in some choreographed display of unity. They simply came down to the floor to where Veilkorath stood, and they stood with him. Equal ground, the way it had always been done at the farmstead. From somewhere far below the spire, carried on the night air through the open observatory, came the faint clatter of crockery. The Drakenholm kitchens, run by a mixed staff of human and draconic cooks, organized on principles that predated any of their training manuals, were cleaning up after the evening meal. The sound was so ordinary, so unremarkable that none of the counselors noticed it. But Veilkorath did. He had been listening for that sound for 570 years, the sound of people feeding each other, and he heard it everywhere. Counselor Jesrin, Thesrin's own daughter, barely past her first century, her scales still carrying the bright copper of youth, spoke into the quiet. "The archives should have this, all of it, the story as you told it." Veilkorath looked at her. She had her mother's crest but not her mother's rigidity, and something in her face reminded him, with a pang he had not expected, of a 7-year-old girl holding up a bowl of soup with both hands. "The official version says the Cathara Accord was a triumph of imperial policy," he said. "That Emperor Rithal devised a framework for coexistence and implemented it through proper channels. It mentions no soup, no ladle, no woman. It does not mention a Sarathi boy who carried water 8 times a day and died at 23. It does not mention a draconic matriarch who hummed egg songs to hatchlings who were not hers because they needed someone to hum. It does not mention fence permits." "Then we change the archives." "No." His voice was gentle, the gentleness of something very old and very tired and very certain. "The archives are what power tells itself. This story is what actually happened. They serve different purposes and both are necessary. Let the archives stand. Just keep the pot on." He turned back to the observatory ledge. The twin moons had climbed high, and the basin spread below, 47 settlements scattered across the dark land like embers in a banked hearth. Human lights and draconic lights and half-blood lights, indistinguishable at this distance. Just light. Far out, barely visible, a faint glow marked the place where the farmstead had been. A memorial now, a simple stone marker and a cast-iron pot that had been recast so many times that nothing of Merit's original remained except the shape. But the shape was enough. The shape said, "This is where hungry creatures learn they deserve to eat." Veilkorath settled onto the ledge, folded his scarred wings with care, the left one protesting, the venom scar pulling tight as it always did, and watched the lights. 570 years, and the pot was still on. He could hear, faint on the wind rising from the basin, hatchlings being called to dinner. Not the formal summons of the imperial court, the ordinary, slightly exasperated, entirely loving call of a parent who has said the word 3 times and is considering a 4th with emphasis. Somewhere down there, a human child was pretending not to hear. In another settlement, a draconic youngster was gliding in from the fields on wings that worked because someone, long ago, had taught herself surgery from a water-stained manual so that damaged things could fly. Veilkorath closed his eyes. The scar ached, as it always did in the cold. The venom had gone deep enough now that he could feel it in his heartbeat, a faint, irregular stutter that the healers watched and he had stopped worrying about. But there was warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with dragon fire. A human warmth, borrowed and kept and carried for 570 years, never returned because Marit San had never asked for anything back. That was the thing about her, the thing no treaty could contain and no archive could hold. She had not saved him out of strategy or philosophy or even particular courage. She had saved him because the pot was on and he was hungry, and that, to Marit San, was the entire calculation. The rest was noise. Below, someone was ladling soup. He could smell it on the rising air, lentils and dried herbs and the faint mineral edge of well water. The same recipe, 570 years, and no one had changed it, because it was already exactly what it needed to be. Veilkorath, elder of the Indigo Guard, survivor of Thornspire, 642 years old and running out of time, breathed in the smell of lentil stew on the night wind and felt, for the 10,000th time, the same thing he had felt the first morning a woman with a ladle set a bowl on the ground in front of him. Not rescue, not pity, not even kindness exactly. Just the quiet, immovable certainty that he deserved to eat. The pot was still on. It would stay on after he was gone, kept by hands he would never know, stirred by ladles he would never see, served to creatures whose names had not yet been spoken. That was enough. That had always been enough. He watched the lights of the basin, and he waited for the wind to bring him one more breath of soup, and he did not feel old. He felt fed.